I wanted to maybe go back 15 years and go forward. I went to graduate school. I left in '91, taught in Savannah, Georgia for a while, then moved back to Philadelphia where when I was teaching there, that's where this story begins. And I also wanted to really encourage you guys to make this a conversation. You don't have to wait for later to ask questions, nor do you have to have something you want to share in the form of a question. It could be an observation. I don't claim to control the interpretation of my work. I'm very interested in how people see, and I learn from this experience, these kinds of experiences. So, Con, are we ready? So, the first group of works of three groups I would say I'm going to show you are large-scale drawings. They're inventions. And basically, I found it so kind of enlightening that I could find my way by asking simple questions, and things opened up for me. So I love Puntormo, and I love how his figures are inventions, and also this kind of mannerist kind of notion of space. It's kind of almost like a DNA, right, or like a helix kind of morphing through space. There's a kind of articulation of refined passages, but there's also something kind of provisional and gestural in his work. And so that really spoke to me. So I'm going to present him, and then the next slide is the Beschers, their work in their typological photographic projects where they would go around Europe and North America and shoot a particular type of architecture, in this case water towers. And the notion of this being so useful to me is because of its typological nature, where the Beschers took themselves out of the work. It was always with the overcast sky, always from the front, filling the frame the same way, no humans present. And so by removing themselves, they actually bring out the personality of the architecture, because that's what remains. In fact, it's kind of been dislodged from its context, so it's kind of thought of anew as sculpture, if you will, right? And so I found that I could kind of engage with these forms and the kind of like the gestural dynamism of Puntormo as a kind of a new beginning when I felt lost. And so that's where my story begins. And so basically, would just take that roll of Arches cover and roll it out on the wall and start with some gestural marks and keeping on kind of smearing them out and moving them until there is something about that abstract movement that talks to me. And then I would simply kind of dive in and start to articulate form, this kind of static architectural form, as if it's alive, right? Like it's like Pygmalion, if you will. And one of my criteria for this new project was to not finish things, because before that I was making paintings in which everything was so refined that I would kind of kill the life of my work. And so that was, it was very clear to me that's what I needed to do. So this is kind of like the beginnings. We can go through a couple of these. In this one, I was kind of just assigning a kind of an idea, like how could architecture have some kind of biomorphic narrative, like perhaps a latent narrative. In this case, I was thinking about metamorphosis, and kind of thinking about kind of a hybridization between kind of built and growth, and also thinking about a kind of a binary tension between kind of constructing and kind of destroying, that notion of building an entropy, if you will. So thinking about this force here of things growing out, and then in the next slide, taking that same form, which is essentially like a slinky, and kind of just not thinking about what it is, its identity as a noun, but its identity as a verb. Like it's fairly generic, but like its function is to kind of crush in, right? And so like it has a role contextually that kind of gives it its identity. And I think I don't know if this happens, I imagine there's a lot of people here who are artists. Can I see a show of hands? Yeah. And I don't know if this happens to you, but what happens to me with projects is that on the front end, I'm okay with simple. And as the project ensues, when I get to the 7th, 8th, 9th one, I just pile on the complexity. Like, I can't be simple anymore, right? And then all of a sudden it's like, okay, the bar's too high and I just have to start something new. But so here's where things start to, like, I feel compelled to kind of articulate tonally more. I'm thinking maybe a little bit more of a kind of a conflation of different scales. And perhaps in retrospect, my critique of this would be that it kind of falls too much in the Dali camp, where my invention isn't held in check by a kind of a stronghold in reality. But the forms, like the kind of like the parachute form, basically what I'm doing is in my studio I have a bunch of reference books of buildings and architecture, and that comes from some colonnade in a medieval church. So where it came and how its new identity, like the Bescher photographs, it's mutable, and that's why that source material was useful to me. In this one, I was, kind of saying, can I stop there? Can I leave something linear as well as something articulated tonally? But I was actually kind of thinking about a particular Rembrandt painting. I don't know if the blinding of Samson, if any of you are familiar, but it's a soldier who's blinding Samson inside of a cave. So the soldier is silhouetted, and Samson is illuminated. And there's something about a black silhouetted form in the front that actually holds in the light. It's a kind of like a device for kind of creating illumination. I was talking to a few folks. I think Aaron comes to mind about kind of adding some kind of irritant, some kind of proverbial wrench into the work, something that messes up what you're good at, so you don't kind of rely on perhaps the execution of facility as the raison d'etre, that there's a kind of a new problem. And so for me, what I was kind of prone towards refinement, so what I added here was ripping and cutting into the vocabulary. So there's a kind of a pretzel logic in this drawing. It's a collage papers in which every piece of paper is both in front and behind. And the notion of torn edges and cut edges and drawn edges are kind of speaking the same tongue. Thinking also about those, forget the name of those machines that are kind of built to break down. They were kind of, there's a name for the, Marshall Goldberg? I'm sorry. Rube Goldberg. Thank you. Thinking about that notion of something that's kind of in movement but also breaking down. This slide is kind of a little bit blown out, but these are little bricks that I cast out of red grout, and I thought of that as a kind of a catalyst for the beginning of the painting, the drawing, and then thinking about a segue into the illusion. And at this point, I started to think about these kind of invented spaces with kind of some kind of visual device where one could imagine themselves kind of walking or climbing through. So like the scaffolding kind of functions that way.
How big are those right here?
So this one, this one's only this big. The other paintings, most of them were 5 and 6 feet, drawings rather, but this one, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, I'm sorry.
No, please.
When you said you constructed the bricks out of red grout, what exactly do you mean? Did you use those as like a diorama? Like, What are you, did you say?
So I went online
okay.
and I saw, on an HO railroad site, and I wanted, I Googled how to make your own miniature bricks.
Oh, okay.
Right, and then I made like a bunch of plastic little things where you pour the grout in.
So these are three-dimensional
Exactly.
coming off of the page.
Exactly. And in this one, I was thinking about kind of like binary opposition, so like wet and dry, rectilinear, curvilinear, color, achromatic, and then kind of giving it them roles. Like I think I was kind of thinking about flies and poop in a way. So like this idea of like they're all kind of have this kind of gravitational pull.
Is there a specific reasoning behind the choice of red for the last one, the squares?
I think that there's something about the red, the high chroma red, it pops forward, but it's a dark color. But it's inherently, since it pops forward, it's inherently flat, and I found like exploring the foreshortening with this kind of frontality would be interesting. This drawing I made as a kind of an attempt to make a drawing that is influenced by the site it inhabits. And so it was, this is its second incarnation. In its first incarnation, it had a MAB paint sea green because the gallery was green. But I was thinking about like what's going on in the systems behind the wall as a kind of engaging that notion of the architecture, this as a kind of coming into the work. And so the work itself, they're all the same proportion, but they get smaller and flatter. There's some drawing on the wall, and I'm bending electric conduit, right? And again, thinking about this kind of this starting out with these abstract moves and thinking about kind of articulating form, but not to be stable, but to be unstable. So that kind of play between building and entropy again. This drawing, we actually went to Buffalo one time, about 7 years ago, at the Albright Knox Gallery. There was this awesome show that had Janine Antoni, and it had Sarah Z. This great Ron Buick sculpture. It was a great show. But I remember, being miles away and seeing the steam rising from Niagara Falls. And that kind of sensation kind of was the germ of this. So I also was thinking about kind of ways in through the patterns and thinking about that steam rising. But this is two pieces of paper that kind of interfit the left and right. So kind of thinking of it maybe too as a kind of like a coupling, if you will. So like as I show you new bodies of work, you'll see that the work shifts, but the notion of the architectural and the body kind of runs through all my work. And whether I was conscious of those things heading into new work or not, now I am, and it becomes a kind of a conceptual constant from here forward. I feel fairly committed. So there's a little detail. This is something I called Study for a Monument. This is kind of influenced by visionary architects who make these kind of plans for buildings that they don't assume will ever be built. But it's kind of like an insight into their inner vision, if all their dreams came true. And so kind of thinking about making a drawing that's almost like a plan that has a kind of a plausibility to it. Like it's kind of diagrammatic, right? This drawing is just a little bit smaller than you see, and you can see those kind of dark lines there. That's because it's in relief, and that's the cast shadow. And I was thinking about, like in the previous work, you probably noticed like there's that when I talked about metamorphosis, like there's this kind of giving birth or one cylindrical form begetting another. So there's this kind of generative quality that's kind of like a metaphor for the creative process. And in here you'll see that there's this kind of strange cast shadow down here. And that strange cast shadow is actually a photograph of the drawing in process, and then I projected it with a projector obliquely. So it's a kind of, I was thinking about that Holbein Ambassadors painting where if you look at it from the lower corner, there's this weird distortion, and you look at it just right, it becomes a skull. And it's this kind of covert memento mori, if you will. And so like this is actually like this dark spot, but it's actually the same form language in a kind of a distorted manner. Okay, so when I'm, a lot of that work, well, at least it began when I lived in Philadelphia, and I lived in Fishtown, which is a kind of a post-industrial wasteland. And so there's a lot of beautiful decay and kind of like a scary vibe at the same time. When you're there, you're not kind of like, oh, you're not in a dreamy state, you're like in a state like this. But when I got the job at SIUE, you know, I really felt like I had to kind of embrace something new to kind of have my work honestly kind of reflect my experience. There's like a 2-year or 3-year lapse. What I did was I kind of had some kind of scary moments where I got stung by Hymenoptera wasps, hornets, bees, different times where I went into anaphylactic shock and had to get revived. And so I thought of that as a kind of a springboard for a new body of work. So I was kind of featured in an article in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where I grew up as a kid because you know, that my mom had to drive through the fairgrounds when it was going on to get me to the hospital because I stepped into a bunch of yellow jackets on the first day of football practice, and I nearly bought the farm. And then later, when I was in Edwardsville, Illinois, where I live now, I was alone with my daughter Honor, and I was clipping the hedges, and I got stung by a wasp, and then I kept on cutting, and I got stung again. And my wife had insisted that I have an EpiPen, and I said, "Oh, please don't infantilize me. I'm fine. I'm cured," you know. And it was really good that she forced me to have it. At any rate, I thought of that that sense of those experiences of having bouts with mortality as a kind of a place to locate a new body of work. So the first thing that I thought about was creating an allegory of cutting my shrubs and getting stung. And so I decided to take the shrub or the woody plant, if you will, and think of it as a self-portrait in which the branches would kind of run in tandems with one another to kind of assume the identity of a vascular system, right, like veins and arteries. And of course, at times they have to kind of assume the role of bone in order to read like a body, but basically that's what I did. And I was looking at folks like Vesalius, and what I did in that first drawing is I blind appropriation. I took that Raphael drawing of Apollo playing the violin, put it in a blender with Vesalius, and there you have it. And then the head became a nest. Like that earlier drawing with the red squares, I decided to make another body as a woody plant vascular system, only have wet and dry, red and achromatic. And this, you can see this, it's body size. And if you go to the next slide, Connor, you'll see that it's based on a Jericho study from Rafted Medusa. This probably helps kind of see what's going on. And then the next slide. all these things. My brother is a pediatrician, and he was talking to me about the physiology of anaphylaxis, and I was holding on for dear life. But the terms that he used, like mast cells, that kind of resonated with me as an iconography to fold in. So that's somebody who doesn't have a good grasp of biology's interpretation. And if you go back just a second, then you can see the details, right? So, thanks. And you know, I often talk to my students about kind of like finding their content by first kind of exploring their own stuff as a lens of looking out at the world, right? Like, there's 8 billion of us, and so I'm really not that special. But because I've had certain kinds of experiences, it gives me insight into that realm as a kind of a beginning, then to research about similar things out in the world. Does that make sense? Okay. So what I decided to do, was to kind of think about those parallel things, those like my vulnerabilities and others and so forth like that. I first began this kind of duality, if you will, by thinking about my kids and when they're playing their innocence and the subject they're playing with, I see like the darker undertones. So when they're playing with the train set and it's not so far after the Madrid bombings, you know, I'm thinking about the kind of like those parallels. So the way that I started this drawing, it's just a little bit, it's 60 inches, so this is a little bit bigger. But I basically put their wooden train set on the paper, and I sat down, shone a light, and my wife, you know, traced where my skin was touching and the shape of the shadow, and that began the drawing. I then drew the Madrid subway map and thought about that bomb blast as the light, only I reversed the values so the shadows become white and the lit areas become dark, and the smoke of the bomb blast become a kind of like a frame. And so here's a detail where you can see the different times of those different bomb blasts on March 11th. Related to that, you know, laying down on the paper again and thinking about the bodies, the particularity of scale, like it's not like a picture of a body, it's the presence of a body, right? So it's like when you see it in person, there's a kind of a relational scale that you feel like a human presence. And thinking about like after that has been traced, the skin and the shadow, kind of raising up with the XYZ axes my vascular system. But thinking about that now as a kind of a, almost like something to hang a memorial on, like a spontaneous memorial, if you will. So that's what this one is. And if we get to the next slide, you can see a little bit closer that there's medallions hanging off of them, and each of the medallions has a relief of 2 letters, its initials. And then here it's the first name of every person that it refers to and their age. So if we start on the left, we go with the youngest, and we go to the head, we get the oldest, we get their first name and their initials. And all these people died at one time, and it was a kind of like a way of slowing down like the news, right? Like, okay, a lot of people died, that's really too bad, man, I feel awful. Okay, now on to sports. And so like how to kind of slow that down and kind of internalize it, right? So I was kind of thinking about that in the process. And before our first child was born, a friend of ours, what is it called when you pay an artist to do something? Thank you. He commissioned a bunch of Mennonite women to make a prayer quilt for our daughter. And I was thinking about that notion about this kind of collective focus on somebody outside of yourself in the act of creation. And I was thinking about that as a kind of a helpful lens to kind of maybe break out of some of my narcissism. Similar to that, this one, I'm laying down on the paper and getting traced, but then I'm transposing that into kind of a foreshortened plane. And that slab is the state of Illinois. And again, it's a memorial site. I stamped in copper the names of everybody. This is like all the people who from Illinois who died in the Iraq War up to the time I stopped making the work. And then I made these kind of illusions of stele, like these grave marker house kind of things. And then I had these punches, and I punched into the paper the name of their hometowns. And there's another one. It's got kind of grizzly stuff. So that's okay. You can move on. So now, I'm thinking about that narrative about, my vulnerability and other folks' vulnerability, and trying to kind of think, how can I continue along that conceptual trajectory, but think about a process and a material that really kind of embody that more directly. I was thinking about Janine Antoni and how process and material really are intrinsic onto reading her work. So this I actually saw at that Albright Knox show. There was 14 of these, 7 self-portrait casts in soap, 7 self-portrait casts in chocolate, and you could still smell the chocolate. They took them out of the freezer for the show and they put them back in. Yet they have these uncanny kind of relationships to Roman portraiture, right? Like it looks like a bronze patina and it looks like weathered marble, right? But there's also something about this woman who takes her likeness into the shower and she cleans herself. And as she's cleaning herself, she's effacing her identity, right? Whereas she's looking away at, in this case, her eyes, she's effacing her identity. And the next one, it's her chin, and the next one, it's her ears, and da-da-da. So 7 different places. So you start to put together what it's made from and the process of erosion, and then you start to kind of shift your interpretation because you know those things matter. And so that really resonated with me. And I asked the question, how could I kind of engage with process and materiality in my own narrative? Another artist, Mark Quinn, this work is actually the thing that's holding it in shape and it doesn't collapse. That internal liquid is actually his blood. So it starts to kind of narrow the separation between self and representation of self, right? So I wrote a grant and they accepted it, and then I had to follow through with it, even though there's a lot of things I didn't know how to do. That's the interesting thing about grants. If you say you're going to do something and you're kind of dreaming forward and they say, okay, here's your money, then you have to prove that you can do it if you ever want to get another grant. So I made a mold of my head, and then next one, Connor. Then made a cast of my head, and then the next one. And then I put it into a box, and you can see like these horizontal lines. They're half-inch increments, and mixed, parts A and B plastic, and poured a half-inch in. Let it cure. Spray a release agent, and then another layer, and the next one. So kept on filling those in, and then I took what one could call sagittal sections of my head, and made these oversized frames to be put into a beehive. And kind of thinking about, you know, kind of engaging and collaborating with honeybees. And so the bees then built comb in my likeness, and and then I activated it by building a large light box so that they'd be illuminated from behind. I remember going to the St. Clair Beekeeping Association and getting on the agenda for that time, and I remember the feeling. I felt so out of place. I was overdressed, and then they talked about different kinds of bee equipment, and then they said, now Brigham Dimick has something to say. That's not my name. I stood up and I said, hi everybody, I never did any beekeeping, but I'm interested in having bees build honeycomb in my likeness. And then they said, thank you, Bergamon. Now let's talk about me. And you know what? Then what happened at the end was like all these people came over to me, not only kind of disabused me of my wrong assumptions, but offered to help. And there's this idea of like you have an art idea and you take it into a world where there isn't art, and it's amazing how people want to get involved, how an idea can set things in motion that creates community. Now, as I was doing that project, then that was kind of like the early kind of information about colony collapse disorder, and like these large populations of bees dying off, and I don't know if they have even definitive evidence of what it is, whether it's like the monoculture and the pesticides, if it's about putting like hundreds of hives into the back of a semi, and if there's dust mites in one hive, then they're all getting it. I don't know, right? But the thing about it is, it's like, okay, I'm talking about my vulnerabilities, but we have this interdependency. And through our agency, we're actually affecting their demise, if you will. So, next slide. So the next project I did is I wanted to bring bees into the gallery. So I built these observation hives, and I covered my images with wax, hoping that over time they would start to efface my likeness, right, by building comb. And I would come in every week, take on the day the gallery was closed, and take the hives home, put them back into my hive, and take out new ones, because while there's on the left side of these, there's a tube I could add, and it could go outside so that they could take their cleansing flights and foraging flights and stuff like that. It just never worked out with liability in the gallery, right, for the bees. So it became a kind of a maintenance thing. But the thing that I found fascinating about it is, you know, it starts to become a means of my art of kind of talking about something outside of myself, and that was very, very important. So then I began to take one-to-one scale images, size prints of my drawings, and then putting them into the beehive. And I remember what happened is I was so bummed when they came out and the bees began to kind of bite away at the paper, and I felt like I failed. And then my wife said, "No, that's cool. Go with it." It's like, it's not what I was aiming for, but you know, now I like it. You know, so it's like sometimes one's blinded by what you're aiming for, right? So that's kind of like, so we had the kind of the architectural inventions, and then we had kind of the allegories with anaphylaxis. And I was trained as a painter, and I decided to kind of paint again. So I'm contextualizing that with a couple of images. This one, Emmett Gowans has this beautiful suite of works, these black and white photographs from the air of how we're really damaging the earth, whether it's through mining or whether it's through bombing test sites or what have you, chemical plants. And of course, the contradiction, the paradox is that they're so beautiful. Like if you go past a power plant or a refinery rather at sunset, you know, there's nothing more beautiful. But it's an uncanny thing where you're aware of the beautiful colors are toxic in nature. For me, there's something about the aerial view where it's kind of in this liminal space between landscape, like a recessional space, and a map. And so it kind of goes back and forth between kind of like analytic information and lived experience. So that was kind of like an important thing for me. And so what I began doing is started with my own body, just simply having photographs taken of me, printing that out on paper, and kind of building an invention. And what I found instructive about the photograph is, oh, it's got a point of view, it's got a particular quality of color. Okay, so whatever I invent, it's going to be all grounded in the photographic germ. It's going to kind of determine the light and the palette, but beyond that, I have free reign. And so I was thinking about this kind of notion of the vascular and the arterial as a kind of like a synonym, and thinking about like the clover leaf also alluding to other things, whether it's kind of wing-like or something. And so this is kind of like how I got back into painting. These are kind of little study sketches, but they're kind of a bridge to the more mature work. The idea in the work too, though, is maybe my critique of this work is I look like this colossus or self-aggrandizing, like I'm a big man or something, right? But what I wanted to be, not that everybody's like a white guy who's in his 40s, but I wanted to be every person, right? But thinking also about that notion of portent, you know, like the heavy weather, and thinking about, I don't know, just kind of like this reminder, you know, whether it's ecological or about mortality, that kind of thing. So I'm going to contextualize the more mature paintings with three different artists. One, Sally Mann. I don't know if you guys have seen the movie What Remains. It's available on Netflix direct download. She's a bit of a hero of mine. She works from what she knows in the everyday, and she makes beautiful things. And her family series early was very controversial because some people decried it as almost like child pornography. And you know, but I think that it becomes a litmus test of who's looking, because it's coming from a loving place, right? But from, you know, kind of like depending on where your head's at and the things you're really afraid of, it can become something that's disturbing. So Sally Mann and Bonnard, they saw a couple of retrospectives of his bathing series of his wife. This is kind of like a womb, right? It's also a kind of this sense of suspension, right? It's like she's there, but she's in suspension. So, you know, what is that? She's like a dream state, or a death state, or a birth state. And of course, Millet's Ophelia. So my two daughters are honoring Galen, and once I saw Galen sleeping on the couch, and she, you know, she's just like this total abandon, and I just got up on a chair and I used my point and click, and then I separated into parts and put her in the beehive. There's something about this kind of state of I don't know, sleep, death kind of dream. You know, it's all there for me, but it's kind of in another state. And my girls love whales, and they have about a basket of 15 of them. They don't play with them anymore, but they did at this time. And I just like these kind of moments, this kind of domestic bliss where there's this kind of innocence. And thinking about that Emmett Gowan image, this notion about the aerial view and how it's kind of between a map and a kind of a perceived real experience. And thinking about my little domestic life and what's going on out there in the world. So kind of constructing these kinds of paintings built on the idea of the domestic and the beyond. And so this is a beluga whale, and this is the Beaufort Sea where they migrate to. And so it's our bathroom and the Beaufort Sea. And so I'm now kind of like deconstructing my house. It allows me to be anchored in my everyday, but like my earlier drawings, thinking about kind of the idea of constructing and breaking down, or kind of architecture as this kind of animating force. And one of the things I began to do too is they had these little tablets that they put into their water, and it would change the color. I put the blues in, and it would kind of make me think of a new palette to paint. And so this, what you see here, I think in the next slide I show an earlier stage, you can see that there's a whale and the eastern seaboard of North America there. And so this is Cuba and Dominican Republic and Haiti as the background. So there's a kind of a mapping and a morphing that I'm engaged with. Thinking also about that kind of retreating ice, that passage there, it's the same form, but in different levels of degradation as it's kind of moving around the globe. And in this one, I'm thinking a little bit about that notion of retreating ice, but also that notion of parallel play, where my daughter is playing with her foam blocks, and she's kind of constructing, right, with geometry, and I am too.
I have two questions. What are the general dimensions of these?
This is about 4 feet square.
And then are the figures photographic elements that you've implanted in the painting?
Yes, they are. So I tried to leave an index for that. Do you see this edge here?
Mm-hmm.
And the top edge?
Mm-hmm.
So, and you see right there, well, actually I don't know where that edge is, somewhere I think in that beam. So this is gessoed canvas, and I brought it into a place called Nova Color in St. Louis, and they have a 4x8 flatwood bed scanner. And they're just like doing something this big on this big white expanse. And so like the painting is actually like this elaborate frame. It's like there's this kind of notion of something that happens quickly and something that's a kind of a sustained reflection, kind of like those memorial pieces, So, but I'm interested in also the kind of the idea of photography and painting kind of working together, like photography has this kind of, at least this old kind of connotation of recording objectively, and that then there's this kind of notion of the painter's truth, the kind of the inner vision, and how we see those things together.
So just so I understand, the photograph is actually printed directly on the canvas, or the edge that I'm seeing there is actually the photograph being adhered to the canvas?
It's printed directly
on. Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Are you also painting on top of printed image, or not? Like when you go in to paint?
Yeah, I do. I do that more and more and more. If we go back a couple times, yeah, let's go forward one now. This is a painting on paper. It's also in the 4-foot range. And what I did there is I just took a piece of paper and I just put it through my home Epson printer. And then I cut out that piece of paper on large arches. And then interfit it so it was really snug. And then used Japanese paper and PVA on the back. And then just mounted it onto panel, brace panel. This one is on oil prime linen, but again, it starts with that print. Now at this point, my daughters, you know, they're much more part of the conversation. I'm always asking my wife if it's okay what I'm doing. At this point, my daughter Galen has a much stronger will than me, so she's really becoming quite the collaborator. We summer on the Connecticut shore, and there's a salt marsh there, and so there she is, kind of collaborating with me on the shots. This is about 4 feet the big way, and that is, they have a moon poster in their bedroom. And so I took a photograph of that moon poster and then obliquely across it and then started to paint it as if it's a reflection. My newer work, you know, as I was talking about before, I tend to get a little bit more kind of like I have a horror vacui, like a fear of empty spaces I have to keep on filling in. And so this is, I'm going to show you this in 3 stages, but this is my daughter sleeping on our bed. And in that boat is our dog who was buried right outside our window. So I took that photograph separately than this in like 2 different years. But my painting was kind of a means of trying to join them. So we'll go to the next slide. Then I started to kind of change what was happening outdoors, thinking about a kind of like a dystopian kind of notion of like overbuilding the environment. And then kind of really pushing the color shifts and the glazing. And I think the next piece, the next slide, you can't see the dog, but like a detail, so that's our kitchen below. So everything that you see is what's there, only I just imagine it with parts removed. There's another painting in progress. I'm actually gonna show this in this state. I think I just never know when to stop, and so even though this is unresolved, it has a certain kind of drawing energy to it that I respond to. And there's a kind of the painting started with a photograph in the corner there of my wife cleaning out the cabinets, and she didn't want to be remembered from her backside or doing that activity. So I promised to paint her out, but that became the germ of the painting, and then my daughter reading up in the tree is actually from another side of the house, but I moved it into there. So this is basically our world and thinking about the home as something kind of animated, if you will. My latest project is I have a new brand in which I'm talking about layers of time and space. And so I did this photo project where I shot my girls in this historic home, and they're wearing period garb. And I'm printing it photographically in 19th century processes like the Ferris-based, Van Dyke prints, those brown prints, and those blue prints, using the specific color and format of those old photographs as kind of like the photographic germ. And then as I build out in space, I'm going to be kind of exploring the same person in contemporary times and contemporary color, and how those two things kind of collide in the same space. So there's a close-up you can see. This is, all my paintings kind of start this way, only now I regard these as cartoons. And so this is going to beget a painting, and so I can show them side by side. And I'm also building a three-dimensional model. This is kind of like early stages, but it's not a model of the house, it's a model of the drawing of the house, so this kind of forced work perspective. It's everything takes forever because it's wacko, but kind of thinking about kind of like that kind of liminal space between kind of like a painted space and a physical space. There's a little close-up, and the next is another cartoon. It's about maybe about 56 inches or something across. And coming closer, the next one you can see it's playing marbles on the floor there. Still miles to go, but it's kind of where I'm headed.
Could you speak to how you go about developing the perspective in your paintings? Because they seem like they're conventional, the way all of your diagonals are. And can you speak to how you come up with that, or what?
Sure. Well, one of the things that I'm doing here, you guys can see that I'm kind of joining papers, and I'm thinking about in these cartoons that I want to find the composition, so I deliberately want to actually even reveal it to the public, where the thing grows. It's like it starts with the photograph, and things kind of generate from the photograph in its perspective. But I'm interested in kind of how space itself is malleable and is a kind of like perhaps like the music of the content, if you will, right? And so they have kind of axes. In this one, you can see I'm pounding nails into my drawing going this way, and another one's going on a diagonal axis. Other times I'm kind of like the horizon line and the different kind of vanishing points they're intuitive, but they're measured. In other words, there's a kind of a progressive measurement that's really important to me, but it's not preordained. I kind of feel it out, and so I'm just kind of finding my way. And so this is the show that's opening on Saturday, and I'm showing with Justin Sorensen. His work looks really interesting online, and thank you very much.